good morning. Yeah, so today we have Professor M D Nalpat with us. He is also an honorary director at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, the UNESCO Peace Chair for Peace, Justice and Human Rights, and a journalist. And I think all of you who watch television news would have seen him. You can also follow him on X. He generally makes a lot of political comments there. Yeah. And today is going to talk to you about the Indo-Pacific and the security situation and its relevance to India. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Maybe you can switch up one of those fans that's making a lot of noise.
Thank you very much, Dr. Padmarani, and I just want to say that I'm honored to be here because I remember the inception of this department, Madhav Vittal Kamath. He was a journalist for a very long time, highly respected, and it was his dream to set up a department. His dream to, as Abdul Kalam says, ignite young minds. And I'm very happy to see that that dream came true in his lifetime, and that dream has been very strongly carried forward by Dr. Padmarani and the really superb team that's here. And not to mention the most important component of all, namely you, namely the students. So we have had outstanding individuals in every batch of the MIC, and I've had the privilege of meeting several of the batches of the MIC, and I just want to say that, as I said, this was the brainchild of a very wonderful person. You can talk in terms of being great, of being famous, or whatever, but I think the most important thing is that if a person is a good person, is a wonderful person, a humane human being. I think that's the most precious gift of all. And Madhav Kamath was that. And it was in that spirit that he created this department. And that spirit of a human being having humanity as the core value. So again, from that point of view, I'm delighted to be here today. I think one should do.
Yes.
I don't know if that's the latest version of what is called music, but if so, it's a very unusual version.
Definitely not.
I'm glad. Because, well, I'm sorry, the music doesn't agree with you.
Hello?
I think Srinath will be done with that. If they can't hear me. This basically reminds me of the early days in geopolitics. When we started geopolitics in Manipal, back when it was conceived in 1998 by the Chancellor, Dr. Ramdas Pai, and the then Vice Chancellor, Dr. M.S. Vadyathan. It took more than more than 5 or 6 years before anybody could understand why, when you got geography and you got politics, what on earth is geopolitics? So there was a lot of, if I may say so, protest, in the sense, intellectual protest about the whole concept of Manipal being probably the first university in Asia to introduce geopolitics as a distinct subject to study and to set up a chair in geopolitics. So, I mean, what we have heard just now are obviously the sounds of protest, and that brings me back to the early period of geopolitics when it was not really very well known anywhere around the world, and not in our continent, certainly not in our countries. Having said that, I'd like to say that the choice that we have, Dr. Padmanabhi has chosen, which is basically security in the Indo-Pacific. The point is that when you're in communications, essentially you're communicating issues that happen. And a lot of that, the proficiency in that will also come from anticipating issues that are going to happen and understanding the issues that are actually happening. This is vital in communications. If you have a problem in looking into the direction of the flow of events, looking into the composition of the flow of events, you're going to have problems in accurate presentation. You're going to have problems, you'll have miscommunication. You have disinformation, misinformation, information. Now we all know the difference between disinformation, which is deliberate misinformation. Misinformation could be accidental, disinformation is deliberate, and information, which is the actual flow. So which is where understanding issues is very relevant. Now, I mentioned to you earlier about geopolitics, a subject that I've been looking at for quite some time actually. I think quite some time. But I'd like to say that when geopolitics today has infiltrated every aspect of our lives, when we see, whether it's the sphere of health, in which you see this COVID pandemic, it had its origin in Wuhan, and certain decisions were taken, I'm not going to go into the reasons why, that domestic flights would be cancelled, but international flights should be allowed to go on. You had the WHO certifying that COVID was perfectly safe, it was not transmissible, and secondly, that it was not an airborne disease, and it spread across the world. You can have a situation in terms of agriculture, where supposing you have certain seeds that are not resistant to certain pests that can be, for example, these days artificially introduced. Then you understand that we are living in a concept in a hybrid age. We talk about hybrid lectures. Since COVID especially, hybrid lectures have become the norm. You have part virtual and part face-to-face. And you've got the concept of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is not simply soldiers shooting at each other with whatever guns and other weaponry they have. It's also infiltrating into your mind space. And that form of warfare is a very important warfare where communication students are concerned. Because what does it involve? It involves creating through social media memes, dialogues, illustrations, which are, many of them are created through AI, many of them created through normal human intelligence. And I'd like to say I'm not one of those who are alarmed about AI. All said and done, there is human intelligence behind AI. There is HI behind AI. You can't have AI independent of HI. Wherever you look, there will be an HI. And I recall a time, frankly, I've been in a time when your parents were not even thinking about, you, nor were they thinking possibly about each other. And I remember that back in the 1980s, when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, was very much into computers. Let's introduce computers as many places we can. There was a huge uproar about computers. that if you introduce computers, then human beings are going to lose their work. You're not going to get jobs. Computers will take over the jobs. Now, I don't know if any of you have read something, have seen a movie called The Imitation Game. Since we're in communications, I can talk to you about that. I would strongly urge that you watch that particular game, because that showed the origin of the computer and the scientist who created it, Alan Turing. He is the scientist who decoded the German Enigma cipher machine. And as a consequence of that decoding, the Allies won the war. You can say the Allies won the war because of X reason or Y reason. The most important reason was they were able to read the communications of the Oberkommando of the Wehrmacht, which is Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces, in the clear as they were being transmitted as a consequence of Alan Turing. Alan Turing didn't have a very happy life, whether in Bletchley Park or anywhere else, but that's a different story. But it's a very interesting movie, and I encourage you to read it. The development of the computer. The computer helped shorten World War II. It saved millions of lives. In the same way, AI can increase lifespans, save millions of lives, and very importantly, has the potential to prevent what in Japan, for example, you call, in the old days in Japan, it's a little bit better now, not enough, but a little bit. The working man, so to speak. In fact, the Japanese were a very patriarchal society. I'd like to say that that is a ridiculous situation, because gender equality is fundamental to progress. Wherever you have a lack of gender equality, the more you have gender equality in parts of India, the more developed that part of India is. The more there is gender equality in parts of the world, the more developed that part of the world is. You check it out statistically, you can find that out. But coming back to that, the fact of the situation is that computers helped humanity. Today you have a situation in which many individuals have to work, forget 8 hours and a 5-day week. You have to work 10, 11, 12 hours sometimes. And almost in effect have a 6-day week or a 7-day week to keep abreast of what's happening. AI can help you shorten that and go back from 6 days to 5 days, and nowadays a large number of people are, with the help of AI, with the help of the systems that they have, access to information they have, they're going to a 4-day week. Hopefully someday we'll go into a 4-hour 4-day week. Because life, the question is life meant for working, or is working meant for life? It's a question that has been asked many times before. And it's a question that I think everybody needs to ask. Are we working because we want to enjoy a life? Or are we having a life for the purpose of working? So I think AI, like computers, is going to be a game changer in terms of giving us a situation where you work for life, not live for work. So I am a very positive person regarding what AI is concerned. Having said all that, going back to technology, what I wanted to say was, technology is being used in the social media space to basically create silos. Now the problem that we have as each of us as communications people, we are very comfortable in our own silos. Let's say, for example, I like a particular film star. I'm not going to get into any more contentious issues, I'm sorry. But let's say that I like a particular film star and you don't. I'd like to stick to the magazines and reports and online observations which are favorable to that particular film star. If I read something unfavorable, I'm not happy about it. Why should I read something that I'm not happy about? I mean, that's not the purpose of leisure. Purpose of leisure is to be happy. So I go deeper and deeper into my own silos. That can also operate in the reverse direction. If I don't like something, if I don't like a country, for example, if I don't like a system of governance, for example, I will be more comfortable in a silo that suits my temperament. So if I don't like a country, let's say country X, then I'll go deeper and deeper into social media silos that basically have the same view as I have. Country X is horrible. It's worse than horrible. It's terrible. It's worse than terrible. It's atrocious. I'm not going to bother about any other silo. I'm not going to look at alternative silos. I would encourage you, for example, to be a member of groups that are completely opposed to each other. WhatsApp is a huge problem because everybody seems to believe that unless you post 10 messages a day on WhatsApp, somehow you're not doing the platform a favor. In my personal view, it's becoming a bit of a horror now to see the number of messages, all of which, hi, how are you, terrible, oh, how were you yesterday, horrible, how are you going to be tomorrow, I don't know. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of that kind of stuff can be kept out of your messaging, but I mean, it's freedom of messaging, it happens. But what I'm saying is that it's important to look at opposing silos, fringes, because the whole purpose of a harmonious society is to ensure that the fringes, both fringes, I'm not talking about one fringe, both fringes start shrinking and the moderates in the middle grow. A healthy society is like that. An unhealthy society is when the fringes become more and more dominant. When more and more people come to the fringe and the moderates in the middle who are not part of either faction, they shrink in numbers. Then that society becomes what's called polarized, it becomes unhealthy, and you're seeing that discourse in many countries. United States, for example, you're seeing that discourse. You're seeing it in many other countries, which is not a symptom of good health in a society. Because in good health in a society, the extremes have to be reduced and the average, the central tendency, what we call, the central tendency has to be in the moderate direction. If the central tendency in statistics is in one direction or the other, it's not healthy. In one fringe or the other is gravitating towards one fringe or the other, it's not healthy. And if you look at social media today, you'll find a lot of gravitational pull, not towards the moderate middle, but towards one extreme or the other. It's a problem. And it's a problem because it's part of hybrid warfare. There are countries where this kind of an operation on other countries, target countries, is very systematic. So not only do you find good things about that particular country, you hate your own country. Your own country is horrible. If you're an American, America is terrible, ghastly. It's the worst country in the world. If you're from India, oh my God, it's terrible. This is a horrifying country to live in. If you're in some other country which is the target country, it's a horrible country. So it's not just having positive feelings towards the country that is beaming these messages to you. It's having negative feelings about your own country, and the reason for that is it brings down morale, it brings down self-confidence. And we all know how important morale and self-confidence is in ensuring achievement. Long ago in the Bhagavad Gita, it was said that you aim at the stars and you miss the stars, it doesn't matter. Aim at the moon and hit the moon, it's not so important. Aim high and miss is better than aiming low, and even if you hit it. If you don't hit it, it's a different point of view. But the point is aiming high. Why do you aim high? You aim high because you have that confidence in yourself. And each of us has the ability to aim high. Because, as has been said for a very long time, we are, as a species, horizontal. We are different but equal to each other. We are not vertical, high, low, in between. Some of us are superior, some of us are inferior, some of us are in between, some of us are partly superior, some of us are partly inferior. Not at all. We are all the same. Absolutely the same. You look at a carpenter, and one has to respect. I mean, there are many things about Germany that you don't like, many things about Australia that one may not like. But one thing that is there is that that kind of activity is regarded with the same respect as teaching in a school or university. There is no lack of respect for somebody who's doing carpentry or who's doing, for example, house painting, than who's doing teaching in a school or whatever. And why? Because you accept that society is horizontal, that everybody has special gifts and special qualities. They may be different, but they are special. So each of us has that special quality. And that is where the question of looking at society in this horizontal way is very important for each of us. Because otherwise, we tend to fall into the trap of assuming a vertical view of humanity. And that is a very dangerous trap because it has led the world into conflicts on multiple occasions. You simply go back into the last war, the last major world war in the 1930s, it erupted, 40s. It was entirely based on this false notion of superiority. You look at geopolitical tensions, it's based on the concept of superiority. We are superior to the other. We should dominate the other. We should not live and let live. It's different. A lot of these tensions and problems come because of the concept of this vertical world order, vertical view of humanity. And that is where, for example, I'd like to come to the point of the Indo-Pacific. Now, there was an age in which is called the era of the Atlantic Age. Both sides of the Atlantic were the geopolitical center of gravity. One side you had Europe, on the other side you had North America. These two sides together were the pivot of geopolitical gravity. Today is the Indo-Pacific. That is one side of the Indian Ocean to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Whether it's in terms of economics, trade, any of the metrics that you use to define, define what's happening in the world, it is the Indo-Pacific that is the pivot of geopolitical gravity. Now, what happens if in the past, in the Atlantic Age, there was a tendency towards, in the 1930s, for example, we know, there was a tendency to try and establish supremacy. The whole concept of exclusivism and supremacy. That I exclusively have the right to give you instructions. I exclusively have the right to know the truth. You guys don't have any right at all. That is a very, very dangerous concept. It has done immense harm, for example, to Indian society. I'll give you an example which is not very commonly known. Do you know that the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Vedas, all these ancient texts, when did they become more generally known among the Indian public? When did that happen? Tell me. Can anyone tell me? Can anyone tell me the individual who caused that to happen? I'm sorry, please.
Mine is I think it's because once the British colonizers came, they brought in the system of converting our religious texts into English, which soon became widespread.
Actually, I must tell you, young lady, check on an essay called The 21st Century Anglosphere by a guy called Nalpat. Check on it. I quite agree the English language is a great plus, and I'm always a little unhappy that after 47, we kind of banished English from normal schools, etc., which I think was a severe self-handicap. But no, the individual who led to the knowledge of the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita was a chap called Dara Shikoh. He was the elder brother of a chap called Aurangzeb Alamgir. I don't know if any of you have heard of Aurangzeb Alamgir. Aurangzeb's young elder brother was a guy called Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh knew only Persian. He made these classics of Indian classics. I'm not going to call them Hindu classics or Christian classics or Muslim classics. A classic is a classic is a classic. Dara Shikoh got them translated into Persian. He loved them. He studied them. He became a scholar in the Gita. He became a scholar in the Vedas. He became a scholar even in the Upanishads. And frankly, I've tried multiple times to understand the Upanishads. Till now, I'm really not able to get the hang of it. I must confess, I don't know what on earth they're saying. And in the past, I would get away by saying, well, maybe they're saying nothing at all. I mean, I can't do that really and get away with it. But Dara Shikoh understood the Upanishads. He translated into Persian, which was the court language of the time. And because English was the court language of the British period, a lot of people learned English, right? A lot of people learned Persian in India who were not Mughals, who were not Muslims, to get by in the court, which is the Mughal court. And through the Persian versions of these classics became generally known in the Indian population. Otherwise, knowledge of Sanskrit is an exceptionally beautiful language. In my opinion, 50, 60, 70 years from now, Sanskrit, certainly it will become more and more popular as a language because the grammar, in many ways it's a very good language. It was just never taught. The perception was that it should be taught only to a very limited number of people. Others don't need to be taught any language. They needn't be taught anything. It's like the English, frankly, saying, why do you need to teach English to the quote-unquote natives? Macaulay had a different idea, and Macaulay has done many wrong things in life, including give a lot of wrong ideas. But at least he disseminated the teaching of English. And in my view, that lit the powder keg that led to freedom. Because knowledge of that language disseminated the ideas of freedom, independence, Britain, British colonies. It was, and practically all the freedom fighters of the time were fluent in English. It is not an accident. Whether you look at Subhash Chandra Bose, who won the ICS by the way, Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, Abul Kalam Azad, any of them, you will see that they all were fluent in English. Macaulay lived that thing. Till that time, English was regarded the way Sanskrit was regarded in ancient India. A language meant for the few and not to be shared by the many. In other words, a very horizontal view of society, similar to the British view of society in this period. As a consequence, our own classics were unknown to our own people. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to really give credit to somebody for spreading knowledge of the classics of India, please give credit to a guy called Dara Shikoh, who was put to death by Aurangzeb Alamgir. I think the Mughal Empire would have survived for a very long time, but for the fact that Dara Shikoh did not become the emperor, and Aurangzeb became the emperor. His intolerance caused the collapse of the empire. And I'd like to say that intolerance generally, the hatred, intolerance, it breeds destruction, including self-destruction. But contrary emotion is what breeds creation, including self-creation in sense, whatever. So, this is, if you go back to history, if you go back to geopolitics, you'll find ample illustration of that. And which is why I want to come back to my first point. please don't forget, the most important thing in you is your humanity. And don't forget, this department was started by an individual who above all was a very humane, human being, Madhav Vittal Kamath. I had the great privilege of knowing, MV for a very long time, and I mean, it's been a tremendous privilege. He has always had a smile on his face, always was relaxed. You could say anything to him, including call him names, abuse him, no problem. Fine. He was, look, it doesn't matter, that's your view, you're entitled to it, that's about it. That is the kind of humanity that we had, and that's the kind of humanity, in my view, all of us should try and have. Of course, I certainly don't have anywhere near that kind of humanity. I hope you guys have greater success than I have. But having said that, let me point out. The control of the Atlantic means control of the world. Control of the Indo-Pacific in the 21st century means control of the world, in a sense. If you're talking about an expansionist power, if you're talking about a power that is status quo, like India, we're not expansionist. If you're looking at a power like China, which is expansionist, which wants to expand its influence, expand its domination, then the Indo-Pacific, the Eurasian continent, is the obvious cockpit for such an expansion. And that is where what is happening in the Indo-Pacific today is this contest between expansionism and the status quo. By status quo, I don't mean things as they are. I mean what was defined by Prime Minister Modi as a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, what the Chinese are looking at is an Indo-Pacific controlled by themselves. In the South China Sea, because it's called the South China Sea, they have laid claim to the entire South China Sea. It's like ours saying the Indian Ocean belongs to us because it's called the Indian Ocean. It's absurd. It's totally absurd. The Arabian Sea belongs to Saudi Arabia because it's called the Arabian Sea. That's absurd. The Chinese are using that absurd argument to try and make the South China Sea, and they've almost entirely succeeded in that, a Chinese lake. They want to expand that across the whole of the Indo-Pacific. And that is the contest that is now playing out in what I call Cold War 2.0. I request you to Google on Cold War 2.0. You might find a name that you probably, at least from this lecture onwards, are familiar with. It's a book that came out in September on this new Cold War between China and the major democratic powers. And the main theatre of operations is the Indo-Pacific. So when we are talking about Indo-Pacific, we are basically talking about the contest that we're having now. Regrettably, it's a replay of history. You know, if you keep repeating history, you're condemned to a lot of problems. And we as humankind keep repeating the history of the past. We keep repeating war, conflict, hatred, destruction. We keep repeating that process over and over and over and over again. And sometime in the future, maybe there'll be a pedagogical system, an education system that is different, that teaches us the humanity in human beings. Maybe. It hasn't happened yet, hopefully it will happen. But what I'm saying is that that is the contest that is now playing out in the Indo-Pacific. And that is where the question of security comes in. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of interacting with the Department of Geopolitics, and I talked about a country called Taiwan. I don't know how many of you have heard of Taiwan. Please, if you don't mind, raise your hands if you've heard of Taiwan. That's amazing. A lot of people have heard about Taiwan. It's actually geographically a very small place. Recently, they had an election, and the Democratic Progressive Party came to power in Taiwan with around 40%, a little bit over 40% of the vote. It doesn't seem like much to have 40% of the vote. But the fact is, it's a very, very important site. Another nearly 26-27% came to parties that were not leaning towards China. The balance came to a party that said, we are Taiwanese, but we are friendly with China. Hardly anybody in Taiwan wants to be part of China. But 40%, the Chinese framed the election in Taiwan as a choice between war and peace. If you vote the party which does not like us, called the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, there will be war between China and Taiwan. That was the way in which they framed it. And yet, we have all seen the Ukraine war, for example, the kind of havoc that's wreaked there. Nobody in his or her senses wants his or her own country to be like Ukraine is today. But that is the way it is framed. 40% of Taiwanese stood up and said, we are not afraid. If we become another Ukraine, so be it. But we are not going to become enslaved by China. And they elected the DPP. 26% chose a candidate called Dr. Kerr, the TPP, who said, I'm a smart guy. He's one of the best, he's a very specialized field of neurosurgery, which a guy like me cannot even describe, much less try and understand. He's a brilliant guy. He said, I'm a brilliant chap. Modesty is not one of his strong points. He's got many strong points, I don't think modesty is one of them. I am a brilliant guy. I am smart enough to keep China from attacking us, at the same time to keep our freedoms going. So trust in me, I am a smart guy. I'll keep the status quo. I'll make sure the Chinese don't attack us, and I'll make sure that we keep our freedoms. 26% of Taiwanese population trusted him and they voted for him. But 40% voted for the Democratic Progressive Party, and the Chinese made it very clear multiple times that if you choose the DPP again, so the DPP government for the last 8 years, 2 terms, it will be war. 40% said, we don't mind going to war. We don't mind our country landing up and fighting a conflict like in Ukraine. I must tell you that I was extremely impressed with that kind of commitment to democracy demonstrated by the people of Taiwan. Overwhelmingly, they have shown they reject the authoritarian system. And why is this important for China? Because the Chinese Communist Party has a narrative. That's a narrative that begins from the, 1921, when the CCP was set up initially. That look, the communist dictatorship is better than democracy. Democracy is mobocracy. Democracy is chaos. Democracy is disease, poverty, ill fare, you name it. It's a horrible, horrible system. Well, then what happened? You had democracies doing pretty well. The United States making a lot of progress. So they changed their tune and said the Chinese people are not ethnically suited to democracy. If you're a Chinese, you need a strong government. You need an authoritarian power behind you. If you're not authoritarian, you as a Chinese cannot function effectively. You need strict control for you to be fully effective. Essentially, the CCP is a Han supremacist experiment. The Nazis were, I'm not going to compare the CCP with the Nazis. The Nazis were in a class of their own. They're the most horrible of monsters. I'm not going to compare them, the two are completely different. But what I want to say is that the central lesson of the CCP was the Han people are very special. And if you want to bring out the special quality and do what the Han people do, which is to lead the whole world. Forget about the European people. They're leading the world now. That's a mistake. We should lead the world. The Communist Party alone can lead the world. Okay? Democracies can also be prosperous. The United States and other countries showed that. Japan showed that. South Korea showed that. Many other countries showed that. India, of course, has started to show that. We are now the highest growth rate in the world, which is for a major economy, which is pretty good. Hopefully in the next 10 years we'll have double-digit growth, which basically means that it's going to be a very different India, transformed India. It's amazing what rates of growth do to transform people's lives. But having said that, the point they made was ethnic Chinese need communism. Taiwan has shown that to be completely incorrect. You can say Singapore has also shown it to be incorrect. But Singapore is a country where you have Malays, you have Indians, all kinds of people. Taiwan is 98% ethnic Chinese. Although you have what's called native Taiwanese and mainlanders. Mainlanders are people who came to Taiwan in 1949 after the defeat of the KMT in China. They came ashore, settled there, and began ruling the place, and then of course finally democracy turned up there. The native Taiwanese are also from China, ethnically. Now you have native ethnic Chinese who are a very functioning, freewheeling democracy. Very freewheeling democracy. And I mentioned yesterday to my geopolitics students that if you look at cable television, you'll understand what I mean. There's slanging matches every day on the talk shows. Now, of course, Indian talk shows are a model of absence of slanging. Nobody says anything nasty to each other. Nobody says anything abusive. All the arguments are very carefully reasoned out. I must say the quality of Indian talk shows on television is exceptional. I'd like to put that on record. But Taiwanese talk shows are a slugfest, a verbal slugfest. It's a part of democracy. This shouting and yelling without violence and a peaceful transition of power, a peaceful conduct of election, a peaceful campaigning of election is essential to a democracy, despite sharp differences of opinion. Taiwan has shown that ethnic Chinese are better off in a democracy than in a communist dictatorship. That has created an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy as the only party that can run the Han people in a successful way. Just across 100 miles of Taiwan Straits, you are seeing an ethnic Chinese group, largely Han, who are running themselves beautifully and totally, wildly, chaotically democratic. I mean, if you look at the way what Taiwanese democracy is functioning, you will think that what we used to see in some states in India in the past, and we still do now, is basically very tame in comparison. But this has shown the falsity of that propaganda. So this existential threat has got to be dealt with. How do you deal with it? You can't change Taiwan because today it's very clear Taiwanese people don't want you. They don't want China, they don't want authoritarianism. So the danger of an invasion is very real. What happens if that happens? There are 3 or 4 sensitive points in the Indo-Pacific which are very sensitive, which are very likely to be targets. One is the Himalayan frontier. We are all aware of that. We have seen what happened in Galwan, we have seen what's happened across the decades, across the Himalayas. The second is South China Sea and the East China Sea. The third is Taiwan. So initially I was thinking maybe Himalayan frontier, but I think our soldiers in Galwan taught them certain lessons about which they have learned. I don't think it's likely to be the Himalayas, as South China Sea has already become a Chinese lake. East China Sea, because of that horrible experience, the Japanese and the Americans and the others, and even we in India in our own way, and it's a very important way, don't forget, most of the, I would say about 80% of the trade of China comes through the ocean route, essentially controlled by India. The Indian Navy has got a chokehold on the naval route on the maritime route between the, the west of the Indian Ocean and the east of the Indian Ocean, between the Red Sea and the Malacca Straits, between the Cape of Good Hope and the Malacca Straits. We have a chokehold in there. And that's exactly why they would like to weaken us and create problems for us, so that we keep getting absorbed in our own internal problems, in our own neighborhood. Because the reality is, India's neighborhood is not South Asia. India's neighborhood is Southern Asia. It's the entire arc of countries from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. That is our neighborhood. It's not just South Asia. The Chinese would like to keep us confined to South Asia and keep us confined to prevent the danger to themselves if they become aggressive on Taiwan or something else. So this is the contest that's playing out. Of course, there are other factors regarding Taiwan. One is, of course, high tech. You know that where microchip processors are concerned, Taiwan is number one. TSMC, for example, it set up plants in America, it set up plants in Europe. It's going to set up plants in India in the future. It's not because they're afraid that Taiwan will be attacked. It's because they know that if you set up a microchip processing plant in China, in about 3 or 4 years' time, you won't be able to sell it to anybody outside China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, countries like that. Because microchips are weapons of war. You can implant Trojans in there that can spy and can do various things. So you can't produce microchips in countries that are hostile. You have to do what's called friendshoring. Produce in friendly countries, which is why it's certain that you're going to have a microchip factory here. Which is why the Foxconn CEO was given the Padma Bhushan this year. And possibly you're going to get the TSMC, once they invest here, the TSMC CEO will be given the Padma Vibhushan, possibly, in India in the future. We are going to be a hub of that kind of technology because we are friends. It's friendshoring in an age of Cold War 2.0. So this is the complex world in which we are living in. This is the context in which we are living in. I wish I could tell you that we're living in a world where peace, harmony, goodwill, tolerance is reigning supreme. I mean, our UNESCO Peace Chair is probably the first peace chair set up by UNESCO in India. UNESCO Peace Chair for peace and tolerance, for a culture of peace and tolerance. I mean, I was given the honor of being that chair. I'd like to confess that I've been a miserable failure. There is much less peace and tolerance in the world today than when the chair came to me in 1999. So, if anything, I think I've been a horrible failure, but somehow UNESCO seems to have forgiven me, the university seems to have forgiven me, and they have allowed me to continue and try and see if at least now I can promote some peace and promote some harmony in a way that frankly I failed to do over the last few decades. It's not a very pleasant world that we have out here. But it's also a world where now we are in an existential conflict for freedom. An existential conflict for living one's own way of life. And I am a very liberal human being in the sense that, if you go back to, again, young lady, Google INDUTVA. INDUTVA. It's a concept that says the DNA of every single citizen of India is a compound of the Vedic, the Mughal, and the Western. The idea came to me long back actually, when I went to dinner at the home of a friend of mine who was very strongly, what we call, what do I say, of a political party that was very strongly nationalistic. And he was talking very, the Mughal period, horrible, the British period, horrible. I noticed two things. One, his children were wearing jeans. And two, one was wearing jeans and one was wearing a salwar kameez. And the food on the table, non-vegetarian food. I am a vegetarian since I was, right from the start. But he was not a vegetarian, and he is not a vegetarian. The food is entirely Mughlai. So I looked at this food, and this is the man who's saying the Mughals were horrible. And his daughter is wearing a dress which was introduced by the Mughals. Do you know that stitched cloth came from the Mughals? We were having cloth, draped cloth in India, in Greece, in Rome, the toga. You heard of the Roman toga. You heard of the Greek, beautiful, very, very, it looks beautiful. The sari looks beautiful. It was not stitched. Stitching came with the Mughals. And many other things came with the Western. Look, my point is, the whole of Indian history is relevant. At least the last 6,000 years of it. You cannot delegitimize a history and say only the last 200 years is relevant. The Western period. Or the previous 400, 500 years, the Mughal period is relevant. The entire 6,000 years was relevant. And if you are in a situation where you say one period is relevant, the others are not, you're actually committing a mistake. You are forgetting your own common DNA. There is a bit of the Mughal, a bit of the Vedic, a bit of the Western in all of us. And way back, there was a huge debate in the Andhra Pradesh Assembly about English. There was a huge demand that English language should be completely banned throughout Andhra Pradesh. Completely. No school, no college, no signboard, no poster, nothing. And the gentleman who proposed it stood up and said, he was making his case that it is not for personal reasons. He said, Nainu worst sufferer. Means, what he meant to say, I am the worst sufferer from this policy. Now, I didn't know worst and sufferer is Telugu. I'm not sure it is Telugu. It seemed a lot to me like English. I couldn't help laughing. I mean, frankly, when it was an interesting debate. So when I heard that debate, I couldn't help smiling to myself. Here is a gentleman who's saying banish English, and 2 out of the 3 words he's used in his final concluding sentence was English. You see, whatever the suffix, it's English. Nainu worst sufferer. If I recall from my memory, that's what he said. I mean, pardon me, but it was a long time ago, some decades ago, so it may not be all that accurate. But it didn't seem to me that this was an entirely Telugu expression. I remember a time when people used to talk about Kanta Langot, that instead don't say tie, you wear something, some weird, ridiculous. Nowadays everybody says tie. Nowadays in so-called, Hindi movies or other movies, you have English. In English movies, you've got even Malayalam. Forget about Hindi. Hindi is everywhere. You've got Malayalam. And Hindi has spread because in a very soft way. It is spread organically. You can't impose it. You can spread it. Every language has to be spread organically and not imposed. And they will spread and they will mix and they will meld. And frankly, 5 to 10 years later, you're going to wonder why we had a debate like this at all, because technology is going to make it irrelevant what language you speak. In fact, Elon Musk is now talking about chips in the brain that transmit thoughts. So even the verbal situation may, maybe in a generation, become obsolete. But certainly, languages are going to become obsolete as a consequence of technology. But the reality is, I'd like to say, that's the kind of fast-changing world that we're living in, and that's why technology is the most important frontier of this new war, of this new conflict. The Indo-Pacific is the theater of this new war, this new and this is a war that involves all of us. That is why we must understand the fundamentals and elementals of what we are in today. And we must understand our responsibility. When you talk about freedom, when you talk about democracy, it is not for one person, one party, one country. It's universal. Values, if they are to be human values, have to be universal values. You cannot have values that are exclusivist and talk of them as values. They cannot be dignified as values. Values have got to be universal. So I would encourage you to, basically think in those terms. Madhav Kamath would have been delighted, frankly, to come here and speak to you. Actually, I don't know, I'm sure some of us are there on YouTube. Please watch him on YouTube. He's an amazing individual. He would have been delighted to come and interact with you. Because for Madhav Kamath, the future, the young generation, you basically represent India, our country. You are the future of our country. And I just want to end by saying, if we are aware of the situation, if we understand what's going on, if you study what's going on, you are not going to have any miscommunication. You are not going to be fooled by you're not going to have any misinformation about it. You're not going to be fooled by any disinformation about it. You'll have information about it, and you'll be fully equipped to build the kind of world that, frankly, the UNESCO Director General, Federico Mayor, visualized when he appointed India's first UNESCO chair and gave that very simple task of promoting peace, tolerance, and harmony throughout the world. I hope that the world of the future, I hope I'll be around to see it. I may or may not be around. I'm very hopeful that you will be around to see that. And I think each of us in our own small way need to help that process. Understanding the Indo-Pacific is a small way to information. And information is the centrality of development. Information, self-confidence, self-respect. And that self-respect cannot come at the cost of other people's self-respect. Self-confidence cannot come at the cost of somebody else, damaging somebody else's self-confidence. It is the universal self-confidence and the universal self-respect that promotes excellence. Just as in a good cricket team, Kapil Dev didn't win the World Cup. Kapil Dev and as the captain of the team led by Kapil Dev won the World Cup. The team is what counts. And I'm very happy to meet the communications team here and interact with you. Thank you very much for giving me this privilege. I almost began to feel I should have gone to politics. But thank God I didn't, frankly. I've never had that kind of a thing. But I'd only like to say that, Sriraj, is it okay if we take a few questions?
Yes, sir. Can take a few questions.
Yes, young lady.
I'm Sarah, I'm PS. I love the talk, a lot of interesting points. But I want to ask you about technology. So you were talking about the Elon Musk chip thing. And I had read about something about how chips in our hand would basically be like passwords. Eventually, there could be like passwords and stuff. But do you think that can be like technology getting further and further could be a threat to our once chance at peace? Because even in today's situation, if you see geopolitics, Israel, Palestine, or anything that's been happening right now, there's not much peace right now, and you can see that social media technology has made it so much worse with fake news and everything. And do you think furthering of technology can be another threat to our chance of peace?
You know, young lady, I'm not going to answer your geopolitical question because, frankly, I don't know the answer to that. I agree that now what's happening in Suez, some of us had predicted that you're going to see these hotspots because a certain country would like to promote hotspots. You will notice that a certain country is encouraging this kind of problem in Ukraine by feeding the war, encouraging the situation in Gaza by, frankly, fueling Hamas, let's be honest about it, encouraging situations in other parts of the world and creating trouble spots so that it diverts attention from itself. That's one thing. But, you know, if you look at the human and technology interface, I have a friend called Dr. Joseph Chalin, who is one of the key figures in the American Association of Physicians of Indian origin. He has a tiny little chip inserted into his body, which in his watch gives him at any one time, real time, and please sit down, young lady, don't worry. At any one time gives him information about his blood sugar, his blood pressure, various other vitals. In my own case, I had what's called a stent implanted in an artery about 20 and odd years ago. Now, unfortunately, that stent got blocked, and unfortunately I was too dumb to get it checked up in time. So I had a cardiac event, and after that I got 2 stents. So I've got 2 stents. They're certainly not part of me, in me, keeping me going, so to speak. So in the world of the future, you're going to have artificial kidneys, you're going to have artificial heart. I hope you're not going to have an artificial brain, but you're going to have all that. It's something that is going to happen. And I would like to be optimistic and say it's something for the good. The fact is, technology is dual use. Now, anything, this particular pen, which by the way, I stole from the Department of Geopolitics yesterday. I quietly put it in my pocket, and Dr. Vijayalakshmi, the HOD, noticed. So I said, Dr. Vijayalakshmi, I'm going to steal this pen. So with her permission now, it is no longer stolen. It has been gifted to me by the department. So please don't say it's a stolen pen. It's not. It's a dual-use mechanism. I can write with it. I can also do some pretty nasty things in certain sensitive parts of your face with it. Everything is dual use. Technology is very dual use. It can be put to very, very good use. It can be put to very, very horrible use. So everything is dual use. You can't stop using kitchen knives because kitchen knives can be used sometimes when they're used for some horrible things. You can't. You need kitchen knives. Frankly, the only thing I can manage to learn to cook is a sandwich. Now, all those who take my sandwich, they tell me they're very good, and privately to themselves they say it's horrible, and we hope he doesn't cook any more sandwiches for us to eat. He doesn't make any more sandwiches, but I pretend not to know what they're saying about me. What I'm trying to tell you is, technology is dual use. It depends on the individual as to the use to which you put it. I am a great admirer of those who put open source technology. I am not an admirer of these big techie giant, CEOs who are basically minting money out of hoarding technology, and in many cases preventing smaller companies and startups from developing the technology. I've seen in India, for example, now over the last decade or so, it's not been happening. For decades, you had people in Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai come to me and tell me that, sir, we have developed this technology. It's fantastic technology. But, sometimes they get involved in police cases. Sometimes they get involved in regulatory cases. Why? Because some competitor, usually a foreign competitor, comes to them and says, look, we like this technology, sell it to us. They say, no, we want to make it ourselves. Immediately, they activate through corrupt elements. And they use the laws and the regulations to finish them off. So they can't grow. So today, in many cases, you have got monopolies, which are preventing startups from growing. And in America, for example, one of the good things that are happening is busting of monopolies. It's not gone far enough. And I had the privilege about 2 weeks ago of having dinner with a chap called Douglas Ginsburg, who's a judge in the DC Circuit Court. And Judge Ginsburg is famous for his trust-busting activities. It basically means breaking up monopolies. That's very important. So my point is, young lady, that technology is inevitable. It was part of when fire was lit, when a stone axe was made. It is part of that Neanderthal process. It's not going to stop. It's up to each of us to make that technology benefit humanity rather than be a curse on humanity.
question actually had to do with the situation with regards to China and Taiwan, from the domestic politics of China from that perspective. If we were to draw a parallel with the Russia-Ukraine war, one of the reasons that Putin uses to justify the war against Ukraine is that it's a righteous war. It's a war of freeing Ukraine from the supposed dominion of Nazis, and at least that is how the Ukrainian regime is portrayed in Russia. And there's a lot of, since Russia and Ukraine are border nations, they have a lot of their friends and families across the border. The two people are sympathetic to each other basically. So from what we know, Taiwan, the Taiwanese people and the Chinese people, they have a common origin, so to say, if you go back to the time of Chiang Kai and Chiang Kai-shek. So what is the domestic justification that the Communist Party the Communist Party uses to justify the maritime animosity or even the political conflicts with Taiwan? How do they justify for the other people to keep it going?
First of all, young lady, I just want to compliment you on your question. Frankly, it's a question I'd have expected in my geopolitics class, but I am now getting in the communications class, which really, thank you. First, regarding Ukraine, Ukraine and Belarus are absolutely critical to the security of Russia. They are not critical to the security of Western Europe in any way. The whole of Ukraine and the whole of Belarus today, of course, goes under the control of friendly groups friendly to Russia. It is essential for Russia because Ukraine and Belarus are the two land routes to invade Russia. The Ukrainian gap, the Belarusian space, those are the spaces that can be used to invade Russia by land. So it is critical to Russia that Ukraine remain friendly. If you go back to 2014, you had this Maidan revolution. Essentially, it was a coup. It was a democratically elected president. He was removed from power because he was of Russian origin. And at that point in time, about a little under a third of the Russian population, the population of Ukraine was Russian speaking. Ukrainian Russian, frankly, is hardly any difference. It's like saying that, the Mithila region and let's say the region around Allahabad, they don't speak the same language. They basically do. It's the same. But Ukrainians, they say, no, we're different, we're Ukrainian. Okay, that's okay. But the fact of the matter is, the West wanted to weaken Russia. They're obsessed with Cold War 1.2, where the Soviet Union was the enemy. They see Putin as the new Soviet Union's boss. They forget it's now Cold War 2.0 with China. As a consequence, they tried to have a coup in Belarus, like in Ukraine in 2014. They didn't succeed. After 2014, Putin intervened in Belarus. In Ukraine, they wanted a situation in which the Russian-speaking populations, which in 2014 were basically freed themselves from Kiev. And remember, young lady, the Kiev government banned the Russian language, abolished it. The Kiev government delegitimized the Russian language, downgraded the Russian people. It's what the Sinhalese did in Sri Lanka in the 1960s under Bandaranaike case, you remember. Sinhala only, no Tamil, that kind of stuff. And the Russian area said, okay, we're separate. Big Brother came and helped them. In my view, Zelensky would have been well advised to say, okay, we don't like you guys, you remain like that. Instead of, I never expected him to behave the way he behaved, which was very disastrous for Ukraine. If you check my writing, you will see from February 22, I've been saying this is a disaster for Ukraine. At that point in time, many of my friends in the West were very upset with me. For nearly a year, they were extremely upset with me. But I think these days now, they're saying the same thing. It's a disaster. So, Ukraine is essential for Russia. A hostile Ukraine is a catastrophe for Russia. And those eastern parts of Ukraine are precisely the locations from where you can invade Russia. So why do you want those eastern parts of your NATO? Unless you want to invade Russia. Maybe they don't. But if you're a military planner in Russia, that will be the first of your mind. Why is NATO so keen on that bit of territory? Why is NATO so keen on the Crimea? All these are essential to invade Russia, to bottle up the Black Sea Fleet, to harm Russia substantively militarily. Which is where Putin had no option, in my view, but to react the way he did. He's not going further because that's all he wants. But the more this war continues, the more Ukraine is going to suffer, and finally Ukraine is going to become what Putin says it is now. He's very clear it's going to have suffered enough. Now we want the price. The price is a completely demilitarized Ukraine. He is not going to stop until he completely demilitarizes Ukraine. As far as NATO is concerned, they don't dare enter the war directly. Because Russia is the most deadly nuclear power in the world. Let's assume they throw a nuke into Latvia. Are you going to throw a nuke back at them and start a chain reaction? If you're Britain or France, the two nuclear powers, the United States? Of course not. The Russians can obliterate the United States 38 times over. Not once, but 38 times. Frankly, I've never understood why countries need enough nuclear things to eradicate the world several times over. I thought once was quite enough. But obviously, for military planners, once is never enough. But anyway, so that is the point about Russia. You cannot, Putin had a story long back about his childhood that he cornered a small bear, a baby bear, I think, into a corner. And he came near the baby bear immediately jumped on him. Fortunately, it didn't land on him, but he ran away as fast as his legs could take him. And he said, never corner a dangerous whatever. NATO has tried to corner an extremely dangerous country, which is a very powerful nuclear power. It's a stupid mistake. And now I think they've begun to realize that mistake, and they're now withdrawing from Ukraine, much to the horror of Mr. Zelensky. As far as Taiwan is concerned, young lady, it's the idea of democracy. It's high-tech. Taiwan is the home of high-tech. If you go to Russia, if you went to Russia during the Soviet days, you would find little villages where scientists were there. And in these little villages, you get all kinds of foreign stuff. The scientists could say anything. They could say Leonid Brezhnev or Chernenko, Andropov, whoever was the CPSU General Secretary. He's an idiot. If you go there, you'll be surprised. They're very young. I've gone. You'll be surprised. They attack. They're very free. Why? Because they are meant to do like Bletchley Park in that imitation game, high-level tech. Their minds are free. You say what you like, work on tech. That free mind is the basis of the scientific mind. That is why in China, under Xi, you've got a problem now. Because that kind of freedom will not be allowed. And that kind of freedom is central to high tech and to knowledge enhancement. You understand what I'm trying to get at? So the idea of democracy in Taiwan, succeeding in Taiwan, the idea that people who are Chinese ethnic origin will do better under democracy, or happier under democracy, is absolute poison to the Chinese Communist Party. That is the risk of Taiwan. It's not getting hold of a little more geographical territory. It's not even getting hold of some technological distance. It's the idea of Taiwan that is a risk to the CCP. And it's that idea which is impelling them to look at somehow smothering this democracy by one way or the other.